In mezzo al rumore serve qualcosa che duri.
El Papa León XIV.
Storie vere. Incontri che cambiano la vita. Persone che costruiscono. Uno sguardo originale su ciò che accade. Tutto questo è Tracce. Ora anche in una nuova versione digitale, per raccontare sempre più storie di gente che vive. Tracce, la rivista internazionale di Comunione e Liberazione. In mezzo al rumore serve qualcosa che duri.
El Papa León XIV.
Storie vere. Incontri che cambiano la vita. Persone che costruiscono. Uno sguardo originale su ciò che accade. Tutto questo è Tracce. Ora anche in una nuova versione digitale, per raccontare sempre più storie di gente che vive. Tracce, la rivista internazionale di Comunione e Liberazione.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito, del presente. E tutto questo esiste anche grazie a te.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to this session. So that is about the U.S. that are being put to a test. So 250 years ago, on the 4th of July, a group of men in Philadelphia signed a document that opened with a strange sentence. Well, they didn't say we have one, we command, we want independence. No, they said that all men are created equal and that they come into the world already holding rights that no government handed them and that no government can take away. Among them, there is life, there is freedom, and there was something stranger, braver, the pursuit of happiness. So they call these truths self-evident truths. So these are the foundations of the U.S. So a claim about the human person that is placed at the very birth of a country. The man who wrote this was Thomas Jefferson, and so again, these remind us that some contradictions stem from that. So this reminds us of the fact that the pursuit of happiness is true, is a fact, but there are so many contradictions since the very beginning, because Thomas Jefferson had 600 slaves. He didn't set them free, and he had a daughter, Sally Hemings, who was a daughter he had, but that remained a slave for life. And so we see that we have this politician that later on became a president that experienced these contradictions every single day of his life. So again, these help us understand America today, and we want to talk about the American experiment tonight with our guests. So the American experiment did not lose its innocence somewhere down the road. It was born with this wound already inside it. So since then, America has been trying somehow to see if it's possible to keep this promise that they made to themselves and to the world. So this pursuit of happiness. So we talk about the U.S. in a very specific point in time, not just because of this anniversary, but also because a few hours ago, we listened to the first American Pope, and he's part of this American experiment himself. Is one of also of the, let's say, results of such an experiment. So we can talk about this condition of America under strain being put into the test, having the visit of the Pope in mind. But America is under pressure from many respects. So we will go back to the Pope, but first, let's go back to other hot topics. So America is fighting wars whose ending no one can see. It's divided. There are so many divides inside. And America has always been called an experiment. So the question we want to ask for tonight is, so does this experiment still hold? And does this experiment still carry the vitality it was born with? So we discussed this with these great guests that are perfect for this discussion. First, we have Christopher Caldwell. Please give it up for him. one of the best essayists and writers of America. Is a contributing writer at the New York Times and contributing editor at Claremont Review of Books. In The Age of Entitlement, he argues that the deepest crack in American life runs back much further than we like to think. It's going to help us better understand the vision of the American, something we sometimes struggle to understand in Europe. The other guest is Michael Driessen. Please give it up for him too. An American political scientist. He lives and teaches in Rome. He's a professor of political science and international affairs at Cabot University. He studies the places where religion and democracy hold together and where they come apart. So it's going to help us better understand the role of the Pope in all this. Then we have a third guest. You don't see this third guest. Is a Frenchman who came to America almost 200 years ago. Alexis de Tocqueville, who somehow said, let's, keep our eyes open because democracy could die in different ways. So, Chris, I start with you. So, Donald Trump, the president, is the guardian of this American experiment today. So let's start from that. In your articles, you say that Trump is not a mystery as a man. We know the man with all, his flaws. The mystery is the country that elected him a second time. So if I got you well, the Americans elected it a second time around because they think that there is a national emergency. So what is this emergency?
Much and thank all of you. I think we need to understand that Trump is a. I'm sorry, I think I'm going to go.
No, you don't need that.
Is that all right? I think we need to understand basically that Trump is a barbarian. He has a lot of character traits, like an inability to keep his word. A crudity that make him a very poor leader of men, a very poor leader of any nation. At the same time, he has a number of traits that make him an optimal leader of men, particularly in a time of crisis. So, for example, he's unwilling to back down from a fight. And I think that Americans came to believe that they were living in a crisis, in a sort of a national emergency, as Marco just mentioned. The simplest way to describe this emergency is as a matter of inequality. I think the largest problem facing the United States is inequality. We can see this most obviously and most quantifiably in economic terms. But there's also a political problem. I think historically, Americans thought of their country as a national democratic project. In the modern kind of internet age, we keep being told that power is projected through networks. Our problem is that not everyone is in that network. And in fact, the network consists of a minority of people. Over the course of the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, a lot of Americans have begun to feel that they did not have their hands on the levers of power. This happened in a very subtle way. Americans didn't see it coming. A lot of it has to do with the movements for rights, the civil rights movements that Americans are actually quite proud of. But those things, unfortunately, were administered by bureaucrats, by regulators, and not by voters. Voters decided they want their government back, and that's why they voted for Donald Trump. An interesting thing, though, a lot of people talk about the struggles with American democracy. The problem in America right now is that the country is in many ways being run badly. But there's not a problem with democracy. Americans are very democratic. I think that Americans really care more about having their hands on power as common citizens. They care more about it than most European nations do. And you can see this in Trump. Trump is a leader of a democracy movement. You can also see it in the opposition to Trump. The new Democrats who are rising up in American cities, many of them immigrants, are also eager to make the country more democratic. So we have problems. I'm not worried about the democracy.
So if Tocqueville was here with us, you could reassure him. You could reassure Tocqueville about the risks of a sort of authoritative system that could hit the country from top or from within the system.
Yes, I think that Tocqueville had a number of beautiful insights about the United States. But I'm not comfortable with the idea of a democracy that is always being formed, as Tocqueville did. I hear political scientists talk about America as an experiment. I don't think that Americans look at their democracy that way. I think they look at it as a system that really requires common rules and that is sometimes very agonistic and very difficult, but needs to be done on a common basis.
Michael, you don't need translation into English, but let's go back to Tocqueville. He considered religion as essential, as a very first political institution in America, so that allowed Americans to self-govern themselves without a master. So at 250, is that still true? What is the weight of religion today, considering the evolution of the American experiment? But most of all, my question is this. Is there a version of the American story that could be shared? Because things seem to be apart. I mean, what Chris said about the civil rights movements of the 60s has somehow gone differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Tocqueville is a very good place to begin thinking about the relationship between religion and democracy in the United States and the role that religion has played over the last 250 years. We're celebrating now our semi-quincentennial, this wonderful mark of democracy in the United States. And I think it's useful to remember that Tocqueville came to the United States 150 years ago, early 1830s, at the beginning of the American experiment. And he was coming from France, a country where there was an understanding that the greatest obstacle to democracy and democratization was somehow religion, the Catholic Church. So there was a need to liberate, to free French politics or from religion. And he came to the United States and he saw that relationship reversed in a dramatic fashion. In the United States, he saw that instead democracy, and in particular religious freedom, somehow liberated religious forces to organize themselves, to work together for the common good. So he saw freedom, a democracy, having this sort of liberating function within society. And he saw that especially manifested, I think, in the thick associational life which characterized America in the 1830s. And in which religious institutions, and I think especially for an Italian audience, recognizing a great plurality of religious institutions, Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists and Quakers and Shakers, a very rich, plural religious field, was using this this possibility of freedom, this context of freedom, to dynamically mobilize themselves in interesting ways. And that relationship, that dynamic, positive relationship between religion and democracy, between Christianity and democracy in the United States, is part of the founding myth, I think, of the United States. Part of the story which for many years we told about the way in which the U.S. experiment remains vital over time. And I think one of the characteristics of contemporary politics today is the extent to which that story itself, which is something about our self-understanding as Americans, a self-understanding of who we are as a democracy, is itself contested. And I would say is itself put into doubt, and reflects deep divisions over the nature of that story itself, whether it's actually true, but also whether or not it's fair. So on the left, you have a version, at least one version of the story, which sees liberal democracy, and particularly the role that religion played within liberal democracy in the United States, primarily through a lens of oppression, that was a false freedom, that freedom was instrumentalized by people in power to do the things that they wanted to. And on the right, I think you see a version of that story which has increasingly doubted the sort of impact of the positive impact that liberal democracy can have on religious forces themselves, and wonder, think about the school of post-liberalism, wonder whether or not democracy is a good thing for religion. Maybe democracy is a bad thing for religion. Maybe democracy is the thing that empties religion out of its forces. So I think that division over the story we tell about ourselves is an important characteristic of our time, and has led both, I think, the left and the right in different ways to pursue more exclusionary politics. That they have left confidence that they can meet each other fairly in the public square and have a good faith argument, but also a good faith encounter about what the common good is, for instance. So that division, that polarization over the story itself is a major feature of American politics today, and it's a major feature which I think describes the way in which religion itself has come to structure what we call the culture wars in the United States. That religion is seen as a positive or negative force, but also as a force which is animating these culture wars within the United States. And that impacts the way in which Americans think about themselves, about their fellow citizens, but also how the United States thinks about its role within world politics, within international politics. And maybe I just sort of end this part of the reflection by noting that I think what is interesting and different about Pope Leo is that somehow his biography and his experience, which also reflects the biography and experience of U.S. Catholicism more generally, has him sitting somehow outside of that culture war framework. Some of these forces which I'm describing are actually relatively recent. They're the product of, I think, of a long-run story of modernization with the United States, but in the last 20 years have really accelerated in an exclusionary format. And Pope Leo, he left the United States. He went to Peru at a moment when the feeling of hostility towards the other side, I think, was much more muted. There was still an understanding, as late as late 1990s, early 2000s, that there was a possibility to make good faith arguments in the public sphere, and that democracy and religion could go together well. And I think Pope Leo somehow still holds that within his biography, and as perhaps because of that, may have a different story, a more positive story, I think, still to tell or remind Americans about the role between faith and democracy in the U.S. experiment.
Andiamo dopo da Pope Leo senz'altro.
So we will go back to Pope Leo later on. So I come back to you, Christopher, and let's go back to Trump. So you have recently argued that the Iran war marks the end of Trumpism. First of all, let's define Trumpism.
Mondo Maga che tu hai raccontato e che racconti con grande competenza.
So why this war and not many other things that happened during the second Trump administration seem to mark the end of Trumpism? And another clue goes back to Tocqueville when it comes to the crisis of democracy. So when democracies fight too many wars, it's a warning sign.
Yes, I think that Tocqueville was whatever he says about war. I think that Americans believed that there was that actually this endless war, that these forever wars as we've called them since 9/11, that it was possible to bring them to an end. I spoke a little earlier of Trumpism as the response to a national emergency. Trumpism is a program, and when I say that Trumpism is dead, I mean that program is dead. What is this Trumpist program? Well, it's a little hard to define, but I would say a first part of it is secure borders, reduced immigration, or at least orderly borders. I think this is part of populism in practically every country, including your own, and it tends to be very popular. A second part of Trumpism was dignified work. It was about closing the gap between the middle class and the rich. Incidentally, this is something that Trump had a great deal of success with in his first term. There was actually a marked tightening in the income distribution in the United States, which was very healthy. The first convergence of poor and rich since the 20th century. Why'd this happen? Partly because of the tight borders, I think, which lowered migration and reduced the labor market for low-wage jobs. A third thing, and I think it was a very important thing, and I will get back to it in a second, is no stupid foreign wars. Okay, and that comes from George W. Bush. I'll just give you the fourth item, I think, on this list, which is drain the swamp. This is a strange American expression. Strange partly because I think it comes from Italian. I think it comes from Mussolini, but it doesn't really refer to clearing the Pontine marshes. It refers to cleaning up government. It refers to ending corruption and punishing corruption in Washington. Obviously, that's not happened. But to focus on why the Iran war has doomed Trumpism, I think it has to do with the memory of George W. Bush's war in Iraq. And one of the things that Americans remember about that war is that the moment it started, in fact, the moment George Bush even began to plan it, the rest of his presidency was over. it was an obsession. It was the single thing that constituted his presidency for the last 7 years. And one of the results is that Barack Obama, when he came to power, was able to make 4 presidential administrations worth of presidential policy, domestic policy, in his presidency. If we accept that Trump was brought to power to fix a national emergency, then he is abandoning that national emergency to fight a war of choice in Iraq. So if he's fighting that war of choice, then maybe it was not such an emergency after all. So the war is self-discrediting. If I might get back to your point about MAGA and the difference between Trumpism and MAGA, MAGA is the name of the constituency for Trump. It is the name of Trump's voters. And by definition, 100% of Trump's voters will like Trump. The problem, and a lot of people say, the Iran war can't be such a problem because MAGA is still 80% pro-Trump. But the unanimity rests in the definition. And the question is not what percentage of MAGA favor Trump, it's how big is MAGA. And MAGA is now shrinking very fast.
Yes, MAGA, Make America Great Again, is a movement that brought Trump twice to the White House. So thanks for making us better understand that MAGA is shrinking and why. Michael, I come back to you. So let's go back to Pope Leo, the other great American figure. You said that Pope Leo is a peculiar figure because he was away from the cultural wars framework. But today, this American Pope is very much supported and loved in the U.S., and he proposed the encyclical Magnificat Humanitas, defining a specific idea of committing to the common good or participating in the common good. So we would like to better understand what does this all mean for American democracy, the proposal that the Pope illustrates in this encyclical, and that go back today.
I think that it is possible to begin to extract what I might refer to as a democratic vision or a democratic theory that Pope Leo has been developing in his recent writings, and especially within Magnificat Humanitas, in which offers, I think, a vision of politics, a vision of democracy, and which is an invitation which he is making, I think, to U.S. society, to the U.S. Church, but also more generally to the world, and the sort of the challenge that I think that we heard today in listening to Pope Leo here in Rimini. And I think that vision very much draws on the specific ideal of Christian humanism, which is an ideal which he specifically names within Magnificat Humanitas. Christian humanism is very much an organizing principle, I think, for Magnificat Humanitas. It's a principle which I think is familiar to an Italian audience, given the experience of Christian democracy, the influence of scholars and writers like Jacques Maritain, and I think tellingly, he quotes approvingly Giorgio La Pira in Magnificat Humanitas. So there's certainly, I think, a familiarity to the Christian democratic tradition of Christian humanism, but it's also a tradition which draws very much on the American experiment itself, and owes, I think, a lot to the American experiment, to the positive experience that the U.S. Catholic Church had in reconciling itself with freedom, by living within and organizing within the American context. And I think that I think of John Courtney Murray or other intellectuals. I think that also looms large in his vision, the essentially positive experience of freedom for religion in the United States. And maybe I could just say a couple things, maybe 2 or 3 points about how I think he may be using Christian humanism and the challenge that he sees, the democratic vision that he sort of offers to us, and that I think he offered us maybe in some way tonight. So the first is, as I think you were saying, and in a way in which is very reflective of Tocqueville, is that it's really a vision of democracy which is essentially participative, which focuses a lot on associational life, on the responsibility of citizens to the common good, the importance of citizen initiatives, the releasing of the types of energies of citizens within a context of freedom. There's a line in Magnificat Humanitas which I think is quite telling, in which he's talking about the welfare state. He's warning against a paternalistic understanding of the welfare state, and he says, no welfare state without responsibility, which is, I think, a very American understanding, or a faith understanding of democratic participation of citizens. So participation, associational life, I think that's essential. The second, I think, dimension which I think is really fascinating here, which I think draws a lot on Christian humanism, is his insistence on democracy not as a tactical political choice for Christians, but he says we need to develop an evangelical language to talk about democracy. And I see very much the tradition of Christian humanism influencing that. If you think about, Jacques Maritain, again, and other Christian humanists, Lubac or others at the time, would say similar things. They would say that, Christian democracy, or democracy in general, is not just a set of rules or procedures which can be howled out, emptied out of its meaning, which I think is part of the crisis that we're living today. But it's also a place where you can do things that are inspired by the Gospels. It's a place where the poor can be blessed, where enemies can be loved, where the mighty can be cast down from the thrones. I think there's this Magnificat reading that Pope Leo makes of, in some ways, of democracy. But it's also a place where meaning can be had. So today we heard again, I think, a very telling phrase by Pope Leo, that truth requires freedom. So the pursuit of truth, which is an essential political vocation, essential Christian vocation, requires freedom. It requires some sort of a democratic context. So that's the second thing. I think the sort of evangelical reading of democracy, which invites Christians to renew their responsibility within the public sphere, I think is a really important part here. And then a final thing I would just say is that there is another dimension to, I think, his reflection or his understanding, his proposal of Christian humanism, which is its global meaning. There's a global, and I would say a universal significance to democracy. So when he's talking about human dignity, when he's talking about human rights or freedom, he also sees, and I think this is also reflective of his own experience, that democracy, the American experiment, is part of a larger global story, that it has an important global significance, that it is not just about the United States and U.S. history, but it is part of the larger story of developing human dignity-centered political systems, which prize freedom, which prize human rights, and that set of things can help global society more generally build better patterns of international cooperation and international peace. So I would say, participative initiatives for citizens, citizen-centered subsidiarity was a very important term. Solidarity in terms of his evangelical understanding of democracy, and then finally, I would say the global importance of democracy. These are all things which I think he is ways which go outside of the culture wars and lead him to invite everyday citizens, the people at Rimini, to invest themselves in for the future.
Thank you. Chris, so I'd like to ask you about something you write a lot about. So the concern about the demise of the U.S. in relation specifically not to political initiatives in general, but mostly to a moral aspect. So the institutions that should somehow hold it together, hold civilization together, well, are often somehow destroyed by appetites that seem to make them lose control. So you mentioned sports betting, predictive markets, pornography on the internet. We could add AI management, cryptocurrencies, and to what extent institutions are part or solution of the problem at the same time. So please help us understand what is happening from this point of view in the U.S.
Yes, this is an interesting dimension to our contemporary problem. It has a lot to do with what Michael was just talking about in terms of the evolution of associative life. Because a lot of our associative life has been replaced. I really don't think that this is a matter of a change in philosophy or a turning away from religion or a breakdown in the family. All those things have happened over the last century, but I don't think that they've accelerated in the last 20 years. What I think it's much more of a technological problem, a problem of changing platforms, changing the technological platforms on which we conduct our family and our social and our religious life. We've just gone through a very difficult generation. I think there are two aspects of this problem. One is that generationally, we are very vulnerable to having our associative life disrupted by these innovations. And that is because the people who are forming habits using these new institutions are generally teenagers and people in their early 20s. They have their appetites. They tend to pursue things like sports betting or internet pornography. The people who usually can teach them and coach them and protect them from that are people who've had experience with the same things. But the parental generation for those children, although the parental generation had many, many temptations, did not have those temptations. And so the occasions of sin, if we can use that expression, present themselves in a totally different guise with which parents have no experience and can offer no counsel. So I think that this has been a particularly difficult period. I think it's a particularly difficult time to enter life as a 25-year-old. But I also think that this situation will naturally resolve itself as people with the experience, let's say, of wasting entire days playing video games become parents themselves and learn to recognize that temptation when they see it in their children. The second dimension to this problem, which I think is more obviously political, is that the increasing amount of time we spend online is connected with a privatization of the way we're governed. A lot of us get a lot of the information and a lot of the services that we used to get from government, that is, from an institution that we shaped and participated in, at least in theory. We get a lot of those services now from private interests, and those private interests do not always have our interest at heart, and they are subject to corruption. Perhaps we can discuss that corruption a little later on. I think that's maybe enough on the subject for now.
Yes. as far as this second aspect is concerned, I mean, politicians, institutions play a role in that. And then you have, the role of families. But from this point of view, you know Europe very well. Do you think that Europe, is more capable of reacting to this phenomena, also in institutional terms? Because, the Americans seem to be the only innovators. So they innovate a lot, but there are no rules.
It's a very interesting question, I think, of high politics. And right now, one of the major issues of contention between the two continents is obviously the European Union's attempt to regulate the very largest American internet companies. And it's quite evident that the Trump administration takes this as a sort of mortal threat to the American economy. So I would, and I do not know, and whether Europe is able to resist the Trump administration's defense of the Google, Facebook, Meta type of businesses has a lot to do with whether Europe can develop an independent capacity to participate in internet creation itself. For now, the answer is no. Okay, so that's the way the question looks at the level of international politics. At the level of culture, it's more confusing. I know that all of these problems in Europe, that there are analogous problems in Europe with online betting, with internet pornography, with just the wasting of time. I would say that the same principle that I laid out for the United States is true for Europe, that a generation that has understood these temptations will be better at instructing their children about them when they become parents. There's a final dimension to this, which is whether Americans, because the internet is, or let's just say the business of the internet is more part of their culture, and it's even more true now that we have AI, whether Americans have a greater engagement with some of these questions that will allow them to come up with more innovative solutions. Perhaps they do, but if they're good solutions, Europe can always adopt them.
Michael, it is clear that these are areas and domains on which church could and should play a key role, and this is exactly, the area Pope Leo refers to with Magnificat Humanitas, with his encyclical, because he somehow gives a number of indications on AI that are not given by a government but by a pope. So let's imagine Tocqueville listening to Pope Leo and being maybe much more heard of by people than other public figures. So can the Catholic Church have an impact on modern society, and to what extent, there won't be any further cultural wars, because it is inevitable that this leads to cultural wars?
And I think here is a good moment to introduce some political realism into the conversation. Pope Leo, as a good Augustinian, is always calling us to adopt a healthy realism. So I think this is one place where we can begin to do that. But certainly, if my interpretation of what Pope Leo is doing is correct on some level, he is really sort of seeing a crisis in U.S. politics. He's responding to that crisis in U.S. politics on some level, and he's inviting, he's saying that the political crisis requires moral and even spiritual renewal, some sort of moral and spiritual renewal. And that moral and spiritual renewal will have to, on some level, involve the U.S. Catholic Church. And so here, I think the U.S. Catholic Church and its response to Pope Leo really represents an important test case, not only of Pope Leo's challenge, but also of what place we are really at in the United States. And the U.S. Catholic Church is very interesting, sociologically and ideologically, within the United States. In many ways, it reflects the more general social divisions which the United States, are present with the United States. In an unusual way, it is not, consolidated in one party or the other. That's a very, interesting point, which can be both a blessing and a curse on some level. But so they inhabit somehow both sides of the culture wars. And I think if the United States is to regain its vitality, and going back to Tocqueville, if we can imagine a more healthy relationship between religion and politics in the United States, or recuperating a more healthy relationship between religion and politics in the United States, somehow it needs to overcome the culture wars. I think we need to, at some level, we need to move past the culture wars. I work a little bit in the field of conflict resolution, and there's an insight from conflict resolution that, civil conflict, this is a civil conflict, a soft civil war, some people have called it, at some point has to end. And in order to end, particularly in a civil conflict, you need to construct some new national unity message, some new vision of unity, which different sectors of society can latch onto. Very rarely do these types of civil conflicts end in a neat victory for one side. So I think at least one way in which I read Pope Leo's message is that he is trying to propose some new message of unity, and calling the Catholic Church, in a sense, to heal itself, the U.S. Catholic Church, in a sense, to heal itself. I'm struck by Leo's motto, which he, I think, referenced today, in Illo Uno Unum, which is an Augustinian phrase, in Christ we are all one on some level, but it rhymes very much with the motto of the United States, which is E pluribus unum. And I think Pope Leo was trying to call American Catholics to that. And that's the real stress test, I think. Are U.S. Catholics themselves able to respond to Pope Leo's message in a way which models a different form of politics? I think Pope Leo is reminding us of our political vocation as citizens, that there's a religious dimension to that, and it's not clear to me whether or not the U.S. Catholic Church will be able to do that, and I think that's the political realism. But it may be able to do it, and if it can, I think we'll be modeling the capacity of democracy, the capacity of the American experiment to innovate itself. Democracy at the end of the day is an open political system which was designed for innovation, and this may be one of those moments where a different Pope, Pope Leo, who looks on the Catholic Church, U.S. Catholic Church, with eyes of affection, calls them to a new ideal of unity, and they rise to the occasion. It was this challenge that he launched today to uscite, incontra tutti, in ogni latitudine. And I think that's exactly that message. Asking U.S. Catholics to go encounter U.S. Catholics on the other side of the field, in general, asking everyone, inviting everyone to encounter people on the other side, I think will go a long way to moving the United States to a place where it can begin to have the kind of vitality that we've been talking about, that has marked in a very significant way the U.S. experience with democracy and the role that faith has played within it.
So we are getting to the end of our session. So you reassured us. So the experiment is holding together. So it is not at risk, as it may seem from the outside, but certainly it's going through deep transformation. So I'd like to ask you something about the political experiments that we saw this summer in the U.S. In Europe, there was a large debate about the idea that democratic socialists may have in the future some space. So the Socialist Democratic Party in the U.S. Has always been a minority party. Bernie Sanders was, its top figure, but he was a candidate to the White House, but he has never been seen as a real driving force. But last summer we had some, primary election results inside of the midterm elections that so generated a debate about the big opposition party. So I'd like really to know what you think of that, so that it could shift, to a much sort of much more left position. So Trump has been an answer to the right, but now to the left there could be a socialist answer. So I'd like to ask you to help us understand the fact that Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, New York deputy, says we need to leave aside what we did when it comes to the woke culture. So from a European perspective, it's pretty hard to understand this scenario. So America gives up woke and becomes more socialist. What's happening?
First, I did not say that the United States would not face crises. I said that the democracy was in a very solid state. But the democracy itself may cause great conflicts, and this may be one of those cases. I think it's the emergency that I was talking about is the emergency of inequality. It's an emergency of long standing. And in fact, Americans have not always been inclined to solve that emergency through the Republican Party. Barack Obama was an answer to a similar emergency. Americans turned to Trump because they felt that the Obama approach to this was working less well. But in fact, they might be very willing to turn back to Democrats. A very interesting statistic that was much discussed after Trump's first election in 2016 is that there were literally hundreds of counties in the United States that voted for Barack Obama twice and then voted for Donald Trump. So Americans don't necessarily need an answer from a certain ideological corner. They need an answer that has a certain amount of plausibility and ideological confidence behind it. And so, personally, I am not among those people who think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has no chance at being president. I think that if she runs a good campaign, she can put herself in the running. If you look at the 2028 presidential campaign now as an abstraction, you tend to look at, like, you know, a polling number, okay? Here's J.D. Vance, here's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Who do you like better? Well, the positions of J.D. Vance are probably closer to those of the median American than those of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But that's not the way a presidential campaign takes place. A presidential campaign is a battle in which people are challenged over their record, and there's a natural advantage for the challenger rather than the incumbent. And so when questions start beginning like how could you stand by while Donald Trump launched the war in Iran, or how could you stand by when Donald Trump enriched his sons by billions of dollars, then the campaign gets much more dynamic. There's also an important thing, I think, for an Italian audience, which is there's something inevitable about this transformation of American politics now. We have just had a wave of immigration, really starting in the 1970s from Latin America, but spreading to Asia and then to Africa. And we now have about 50 million people in the United States who are born abroad. That is, there are probably more foreigners there are more foreigners in the United States than the population of Spain or Poland, and close to as many as the population of Italy. In our earlier experience of mass migration, that is, between 1880 and 1920, when we received Sicilians and Calabrians, but not only, also Jews and Irish and Poles and people from all over Europe, it took time for them to enter the American political system. But when they entered, it was like an earthquake. I mean, you suddenly had, a third of the country was ripe to exercise political power with the arrival of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. And we are due for such a moment in the United States in the wake of our more recent immigration. So the left in the United States, it is mostly first or second generation immigrant politicians who are leading this progressive wave in American cities. All I'm saying is they're a new electorate. We tend to underestimate them. They might be stronger than you think.
Michael, I leave you the last answer about these topics. So I just want to say something. Christopher was talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that could be a presidential candidate in 2028, and then J.D. Vance could be the opponents for the Republicans. So two Catholics, but with completely different positions with respect to Pope Leo. So what should we expect for 2028?
Yeah, well, maybe a few points here. The first is that I think that we are in a very interesting, if we look particularly at the Democratic field, we're in a very interesting moment. And in some ways, it's a moment that is really reflective of just the way democracy works. It's a pretty open field. I mean, Ocasio-Cortez, because we have nobody else to talk about, we're talking about Ocasio-Cortez. But I'm not convinced that, maybe Chris is right here, but I'm not convinced that she's, at this stage, a palpable presidential candidate. Maybe she will become, but we're really seeing what we would say, in the United States is a moment where we're letting 1,000 flowers bloom, and so we're seeing really multiple different candidates being fielded in all sorts of different unusual places in this midterm elections, and we're learning all sorts of new things about what the hunger of the electorate actually looks like, both I think on the right and on the left. And I think that's actually interesting. That's actually great for democracy. That in a way which was not the case in the last 10 years, where we was really dominated by a very limited number of nationally recognized political leaders, there's actually much more room now for political experimentation and political innovation. And I think that's generally a good thing. So one thing I would say. About wokeism, I'm not, democratic socialism, I don't think Ocasio-Cortez repudiated wokeism. I think she said, recognized that there were some exaggerations in wokeism. Yeah, something like that, yeah. So there's a debate about whether or not we're in, if the Democrats win a landslide majority, whether or not we're in for some sort of version of woke 2.0. I have my doubts. I know there's people who think that they're going to come back with a vengeance, but I think generally there's an understanding among enough part of the electorate that that was a bad idea and that it lost Democrats really, really bad elections. Winnable, imminently winnable elections. So I kind of think that whatever is coming next, I think democratic socialism is not woke 2.0. I think democratic socialism is doing something different. It's pointing to a whole set of issues which the Democratic Party has not been able to respond to, whether that be on Palestine, whether that be on the economy, whether that be the wars. So I think we're in, the debate has shifted, I think. And so I don't think trans rights is going to dominate the next set of elections. I may be wrong about that. Final point maybe just on, the Catholic question. I have a pet theory that the Catholic vote has won the national elections for the last 5 presidential cycles. You win the Catholic vote in the United States and you win the national elections. Basically, the Catholic vote has swung at the margins, at the very small margins, towards the national candidate over the last few electoral cycles. But, Hillary Clinton lost the Catholic vote in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Biden won them back, and Trump won them back. Now, those are on the margins. They're a certain type of a Catholic voter, but again, the Catholic vote is one of the only votes which is, on both sides of the spectrum. So I think that, a smart Catholic candidate, and it's not clear that we have smart Catholic candidates in the United States right now, but I think a smart Catholic candidate could run on an interesting platform, a Pope Leo-friendly platform, which could mobilize an interesting cross-section of the electorate, and win elections somewhere. I don't count that outside, and in fact, I hope that may be our future.
Could I add a footnote on this Catholic vote question? I think the 2012 presidential election was an example of a presidential election where the Catholic vote was defeated. And the traditional wisdom in political circles is that Catholics are numerous. They are very civic-minded, so they vote, and they live in swing states. So you don't insult Catholics or you don't work against the interests of Catholics. However, Barack Obama in 2010, in his healthcare reform, created a contraception mandate that he applied. It was a requirement to issue insurance that included contraception and abortion. And he refused to give an exemption for it to Catholic churches, including the order of the Little Sisters of the Poor. And everyone said that was really stupid, but Obama's advisors said, no, you're right about the Catholic vote, but what you're forgetting is the number of single women in the United States. And they had some tremendous statistics about the breakdown of marriage. And they decided in the 2012 presidential election to put their bet on single women who wanted abortion rights more than they wanted respect for the Catholic Church, and he won that election. Say that's the exception.
Perfetto. Bene.
Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing with us your takes on the complexity of the American experiment. I think that Trump would have not liked our debate because we haven't talked that much about him, but, well, that was done on purpose because we cannot talk about him all the time. It's important to understand the rest of the scenario. Thank you very much for what you said. And I think that maybe you got curious about future American elections, midterm in November, and then presidential election 2028, and probably we'll be able to comment upon them together. And maybe we will invite you again, so 2 months before the American elections, to make some predictions. Thank you very much to our guests. Please give it up for them. Thank you again to our guests, to Christopher Caldwell and Michael Driessen. At the end of this historical day, this landmarking day, I would like to remind you that it's very important to support the meeting with donations. After all the beauty we enjoyed today, I think that this is really worth it. Thank you.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo esiste anche grazie a te.
In mezzo al rumore serve qualcosa che duri.
El Papa León XIV.
Storie vere. Incontri che cambiano la vita. Persone che costruiscono. Uno sguardo originale su ciò che accade. Tutto questo è Tracce. Ora anche in una nuova versione digitale. Per raccontare sempre più storie di gente che vive. Tracce, la rivista internazionale di Comunione e Liberazione. In mezzo al rumore serve qualcosa che duri.
El Papa León XIV.
Storie vere. Incontri che cambiano la vita. Persone che costruiscono. Uno sguardo originale su ciò che accade. Tutto questo è Tracce. Ora anche in una nuova versione digitale, per raccontare sempre più storie di gente che vive. Tracce, la rivista internazionale di Comunione e Liberazione.